Tonight, you're going to do something almost every human being on Earth also does. You're going to lie down, close your eyes, and expect to stay asleep for one long, unbroken stretch until morning. If you wake up at 2 a.m. and can't fall back asleep, you'll probably assume something is wrong with you. You might reach for your phone. You might worry about insomnia. You might quietly panic about how tired you'll be tomorrow. Here's something strange. For most of human history, that midnight waking wasn't a malfunction at all, it was the plan. Ask yourself something you've probably never considered. Why do you assume sleep is supposed to be one single block? The real answer is far stranger than a modern habit. Your ancestors weren't fighting to stay asleep through the night. They were living inside a completely different rhythm, one your body may still be quietly wired for, even now. Historian A. Roger E. Kirch spent over a decade digging through an unlikely archive to find this out. Court records, diaries, medical texts, literature stretching back centuries. He wasn't looking for sleep patterns at first. He stumbled onto something odd buried in plain sight the entire time. Old documents kept referring to something called first sleep and second sleep, as if everyone already knew exactly what that meant. Nobody explained it because nobody needed to. It was ordinary. It was assumed. Picture a household before electric light existed anywhere on Earth. The sun sets. Darkness arrives completely. No streetlights, no glowing screens, nothing to push it back. People went to bed shortly after nightfall, often not long after dinner. They'd sleep for a few hours. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, they'd simply wake up. Not in a panic, not checking a clock, because clocks that precise barely existed for most people. This waking was expected, familiar, almost comfortable, like a scheduled stop on a long journey. What did people do during this quiet gap between first sleep and second sleep? Kirch's research paints a surprisingly intimate picture. Some prayed. Religious texts from the period specifically recommended this hour for quiet devotion, describing it as an unusually peaceful time for reflection. Some talked. Married couples reportedly found this window particularly suited for conversation, and some historians have speculated it may have been an important time for intimacy as well, precisely because the rest of the household was still asleep and the day's obligations hadn't yet begun pressing in. Some simply lay in the dark and thought. Letters and diaries from the era describe this middle-of-the-night period as a time when the mind wandered freely, unburdened by the busyness of daylight hours. And then, after an hour or so, people would drift back into second sleep, waking again, only when morning genuinely arrived. This wasn't a rare habit practiced by a small group. References to first and second sleep appear across an enormous range of historical sources, from French peasants to English aristocrats. It seems to have simply been how humans slept quietly for most of recorded history before anyone thought to question it. So what changed? Why does the phrase first sleep sound almost foreign to you now? The transformation didn't happen overnight, but the trigger is easier to pinpoint than you might expect. Artificial light spread gradually, first through candles and oil lamps becoming more affordable and widespread, then dramatically through gaslighting in the 1800s, and finally through electric light in the decades that followed. Suddenly, night stopped being a fixed block of unavoidable darkness. It became something you could push back, hour by hour, simply by choosing to stay illuminated a little longer. Bedtimes drifted later. The natural boundary that used to arrive with sunset kept getting delayed by a flickering lamp, then a gas fixture, then a light switch. As bedtimes crept later, the total window available for sleep shrank. And a shrinking window doesn't leave much room for two separate sleeps with a gap between them. It gets compressed into one. By the 20th century, segmented sleep had all but vanished from cultural memory, not because it stopped working for the human body, but because the environment that used to naturally produce it had disappeared. This raises an obvious question. If segmented sleep is what your body actually wants, would it come back the moment you removed modern light? Psychiatrist Thomas Weir decided to test exactly that, and his findings are almost eerie in how closely they echo Kirch's historical accounts. In the early 1990s, Weir placed a group of study participants into an environment with 14 hours of darkness each night. No exceptions, no artificial light, roughly matching the natural darkness of a pre-industrial winter. He wanted to see what would happen to their sleep once modern light pollution was removed entirely. At first, the participants simply slept longer, catching up on what researchers describe as accumulated sleep debt from modern life. But after a few weeks, something shifted. Their sleep spontaneously split into two distinct segments, separated by 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, remarkably similar to the first sleep and second sleep pattern Ekirch had found buried in centuries-old diaries. Even more striking, VAER's participants described that middle-of-the-night wakefulness not as frustrating insomnia, but as a calm, almost meditative state, unusually similar to the descriptions historians had found in old letters and religious texts. It's worth pausing on how strange this is. Two researchers working in completely different centuries and using completely different methods, one digging through archives, one running a controlled laboratory experiment, arrived at nearly the same picture of how humans sleep when artificial light isn't distorting the process. But the story doesn't end quite that cleanly, and the honest version of this deserves a twist. Not every researcher agrees that segmented sleep is the universal human default. Neuroscientist Jerome Siegel led a study examining sleep patterns in 3 modern hunter-gatherer and pre-industrial societies, the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, and the Tsimane in Bolivia, groups living without electricity today, similar in some ways to how humans lived for most of history. Siegel's team found that these groups typically slept in a single consolidated block, not a clearly segmented first and second sleep. This complicates the picture. It suggests segmented sleep may not be a fixed biological default hardwired into every human, but possibly a pattern shaped by specific historical conditions, like long winter darkness at higher latitudes in pre-industrial Europe, rather than a universal ancestral rule. What seems most likely, looking at both lines of evidence together, is something more nuanced than modern sleep is broken. Human sleep appears to be flexible, capable of consolidating into one block or splitting into two, depending heavily on the surrounding environment. Long, unbroken winter darkness seems to nudge sleep toward segmentation. Shorter nights, more consistent light exposure, or different cultural rhythms can just as easily produce one continuous block instead. Your body isn't broken if you sleep through the night, and you're not broken if you wake up at 3 a.m. either. That reframes something that might be quietly stressing you out right now. If you wake in the middle of the night and lie there for 20 minutes before drifting off again, your ancestors might not have called that insomnia at all. They might have simply called it Tuesday. The panic modern people often feel during that nighttime waking, the reaching for a phone, the anxious clock checking, the spiraling thoughts about tomorrow's exhaustion, may be a distinctly modern invention, layered on top of a perfectly ordinary biological rhythm. Consider what's actually changed, not necessarily your biology. Your environment did. You live inside permanent, adjustable daylight now, generated by a bulb rather than the sun, available at any hour you choose. Your ancestors lived inside deep, unbroken darkness for far longer stretches, and their sleep architecture responded accordingly, at least for large parts of history and in certain regions of the world. The next time you find yourself awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, consider trying something almost radical. Don't reach for your phone. Don't check the time. Don't assume something has gone wrong. Let your mind do what your ancestors' minds may have done during that same quiet hour, centuries before electric light rewired the rhythm of human rest. Let it wander. Let it sit in the dark without judgment. You might not be failing to sleep. You might just be remembering how to.